Sorry again, everyone. All right. All right, well, thank you, everyone. We're really sorry about the technological delay. We're really sorry. This will unfortunately not be live streamed, but we will be recording it. If you want to come back and look at it again, that's still there. But we thank you so much for being here in person. We are so grateful to have you here. My name is Kirsten Vermeglish. I'm a professor in the History Department and in Jewish Studies, and I am thrilled to be able to introduce the Leonard Gilman lecture today, Symposium on Jewish Perspectives on Reproductive Rights, Jews, Religious Liberty, and Reproductive Freedom in the United States, Part 2. I'm thrilled to have so many people here to be able to listen. This lecture series is sponsored by the Leonard Irving Gilman Endowment for Jewish Culture. We're so thrilled that Terry Champney, an alum of MSU, who is Leonard's wife, and also his son, Aaron Gilman, can be here with us today. Leonard Irving Gilman had a passion for exploring Jewish culture. His parents were immigrants from Eastern Europe, and he was interested in the Jewish cultures of Eastern Europe, as well as American Jewish culture, American Jewish history, and Judaism. The Leonard Irving Gilman Endowment for Lectures and Engagement in Jewish Studies in the Sterling Institute for Jewish Studies and Modern Israel supports lectures and engagement related to Jewish culture. We're so grateful to the support of the Gilman and the Champney families, so thank you so much. I also want to say thank you to all of our sponsors and co-sponsors, the College of Arts and Letters, James Madison College, the College of Social Science, the Residential College of Arts and Humanities, the Office of Institutional Diversity and Inclusion, International Studies and Programs, Department of Religious Studies, Peace and Justice Studies, the Department of History, the Department of Political Science, the Center for Gender in a Global Context. And if I've missed anyone, I apologize. That's my screen has got a little bit cut off. And so now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our main speaker for the first part of this talk, Gillian Frank. So just to let you know what's going to happen, Gillian Frank is going to speak. He has a wonderful lecture called For You Were Sojourners, Assistant Abortion Travel and Religious Activism Before Roe v. Wade. We'll then have a Q&A after he speaks, and then Representative Elissa Slotkin and Attorney General Dana Nessel will speak after the Q&A, okay? So thank you all so much. Let me, without further ado, and there's been a lot of ado, so I apologize, let me introduce Gillian Frank. Gillian Frank is a history of sexuality and religion and a visiting affiliate fellow at Princeton University's Center for Culture, Society, and Religion. He is the author of numerous academic articles on the histories of sexuality, gender, and religion, as well as public-facing scholarship. He is co-editor of Devotions and Desires, Histories of Sexuality and Religion in the 20th Century United States, published by UNC Press in 2018, and he is currently at work on a manuscript called A Sacred Choice, Liberal Religion and the Struggle for Abortion Before Roe v. Wade, which will also be published with UNC Press. You can listen to his podcast, Sexing History, co-hosted with Lauren Gutterman, which explores how the history of sexuality shapes our present. Thank you so much for traveling here, and we really look forward to your talk. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I feel so welcome. It's lovely to be in Lansing for the first time. Michigan was where my journey began in studying this topic. I discovered the Clergy Consultation Service by accident in an archive in Ann Arbor more years ago than I'd care to admit. And my talk today comes from my book in progress, which is called A Sacred Choice. A Sacred Choice reveals a forgotten history of religious actors and their long struggle for reproductive rights. I trace the story of faith-based movements for reproductive freedom, starting with the contraceptive battles of the 1920s and continuing into the abortion rights struggles of the 1950s through the 1970s. The centerpiece of my project is the Clergy Consultation Service on Abortion, one of the largest abortion referral services in the US before Roe v. Wade. Made up of over 2,000 liberal Protestant ministers, Jewish rabbis, dissident Catholic nuns and priests, and laity from a spectrum of denominations, the CCS was active in 40 states, 2 Canadian provinces, and in Tokyo, Japan, between 1967 and 1973. During its brief existence, the CCS offered pastoral counseling to tens of thousands of abortion seekers and referred them to pre-vetted, legal and illegal providers in an extensive international medical network. And they did so while publicly advocating a theology that lifted up women's voices and advanced their reproductive choices. To set the stage for a conversation about the histories of religious activism and abortion travel, let me begin with a local story. It's January of 1970, and a district attorney in Michigan has just filed charges against Rabbi Max Tickton, the director of Hillel House at the University of Chicago and a member of the Chicago branch of the Clergy Consultation Service on abortion. The accusation: conspiring to help women travel across state lines to obtain illegal abortions. Following a detailed investigation, the district attorney claimed that the 42-year-old rabbi was part of, in his words, an international system of abortion referral, apparently involving many clergymen and many doctors around the nation. The prosecutor's discovery of the CCS made Rabbi Tickton for a brief moment into the national face of this interfaith abortion rights group. When the state of Michigan charged Rabbi Tickton with conspiracy to commit abortion, it used evidence from the report of an undercover police officer. The Michigan officer met with Tickton on December 30th, 1969, at his University of Chicago office. She posed as a pregnant woman in search of an abortion, and following CCS protocols, Tickton discussed a number of options with the officer, including keeping and raising the child, adoption, or abortion. Tickton did not, in his words, quote, interpose my own views or preferences. Rather, he explained, I can be of greatest help in clarifying the alternatives and in sustaining and supporting the person during the crucial period of making decisions. Put a little differently, Rabbi Tickton tried to affirm the reproductive choices of the women who came to see him. After the officer, of course, indicated that she wanted an abortion, Tickton explained the medical options available: a legal but more expensive abortion in London, England, an illegal medical provider in Puerto Rico, or an illegal abortion provider in Detroit. And predictably, the Michigan policewoman opted for Detroit. Tickton then helped her plan her journey, and no detail was too small. The rabbi walked her through the process of getting in touch with Dr. Jesse Ketchum, a Detroit-based OBGYN. He explained the code words she would use to ask for an abortion over the phone, and the price she should expect to pay, $500. He explained how to travel to Detroit and went over how to book a motel room. They discussed how to prepare for the surgery and how she should care for herself after. Armed with this information, the policewoman met with Dr. Ketchum on January 6th of 1970 at a motel in Detroit. As Dr. Ketchum prepared to perform the operation, a group of police officers entered the room and arrested him. Chicago and Michigan State Police then raided Rabbi Tickton's home and office, armed with a warrant that authorized seizing files and documents with the names not only of just the abortion providers, but past recipients of abortions and those awaiting abortions. Luck saved the rabbi from arrest that night. He was touring Israel with a delegation of rabbis from across the Midwest. When he returned to the United States, the Michigan prosecutor sought to extradite Tickton from Illinois in order for him to face charges carrying a maximum 4-year prison sentence. I'm going to return us to Michigan and Rabbi Tickton's story a bit later. This is what we call a cliffhanger in my talk. But for now, I want to rest on some of the underlying themes of this charged encounter, themes that are central to understanding the histories of religion, abortion, and medical migration. The undercover police officer exploited the fact that CCS members shared urgently needed information and helped women find answers to pressing questions like, how can I end my pregnancy safely? Where can I obtain an abortion? How will I get there? Can I trust the provider? Can I afford the procedure? And what do I do if something goes wrong? In other words, the encounter between Rabbi Tickton and the woman he counseled spotlights how abortion history is a history of medical and informational scarcity and a history of travel. It's a story of legal restrictions limiting information and medical resources as much as it is a story of abortion seekers crossing state and national borders to obtain medical treatment. But it's also a story of clergy acting as abortion seekers' champions and guides in these journeys. To tease out these threads, my talk will have 3 parts. First, the material, theological, and legal origins of CCS's activism. Second, I'll discuss how an ethos of pastoral care shaped transnational abortion networks. And in a concluding section, I'll return us to the Midwest and to Rabbi Tickton's story to reflect on the broader historical significance of the CCS. So let's unpack this history of liberal religious activism and abortion travel by explaining the domestic circumstances that gave rise to the CCS and made it possible for Rabbi Tickton to direct abortion seekers to reliable providers. To do so, I want to take us further back in time to the fall of 1956, when the Reverend Howard Moody, a newly installed minister at Judson Memorial Church in New York City, received a phone call from a colleague in Florida that set him on a life-changing journey. When interviewed years afterward, Reverend Moody still remembered the urgent words that tumbled out of his colleague's mouth. "Howard, I've got a woman here who you've got to help. She is a woman around 40 years of age. She has 2 teenage children. She had a divorce, and she was going with this man, and they got pregnant, and she can't get married. She can't let her children know that she is pregnant, so please would you help her? I am sending her up tomorrow." Howard Moody, an American Baptist minister, had only been in New York City a few months when he received this telephone call. His church, Judson Memorial, was in the heart of Greenwich Village and was known for its interracial and interfaith ministries. During their first meeting, Moody didn't chastise this woman for her sexual choices. Instead, he recalled, "I had a long talk with her to see what her situation was. Then I went to work." But finding an abortion provider wasn't easy. Moody, like his Florida colleague, quickly hit the hard wall of legal restrictions that banned elective abortions. These restrictions had originated in the 19th century, but had grown in strength and rigidity in the 1940s and 1950s. As a result, a woman seeking an abortion faced precarious choices. One clergywoman summarized the dilemma of abortion seekers this way: she could serve the sentence of bearing her unwanted child. She could try to secure a safe but illegal and enormously expensive abortion in a doctor's office. She could choose to go through the degrading process of begging for a therapeutic hospital abortion with the odds against approval, perhaps finding herself too far gone to seek help elsewhere by the time the board refused her. She could try to find the money for a trip overseas. She could risk her life and health in a back alley operation, or frantic with despair, not knowing where to turn for help, she could choose the cruel route of attempting self-abortion. With nothing but bad choices in front of them, Moody and his pregnant companion chose one of them and made their way to New Jersey, where organized crime provided abortion services. They were unsuccessful because they did not know the correct password to enter a mob-run establishment. After days more of desperate searching, a woman in Moody's own congregation pointed them to a reliable, illegal abortion provider in Manhattan. Now, Moody's first foray from New York to New Jersey and into the underground world of illegal abortion allowed him to glimpse the outlines of a system that criminalized, that pathologized, that shamed, and that endangered abortion seekers. Over the course of a number of years, Moody, like many other clergy, would realize that this journey through the abortion underworld was being undertaken by hundreds of thousands of women each year across the United States. And we can pause again to note key elements of this story, which were part of a broader pattern from the 1950s onward. A religious woman sought help and found compassion and assistance from clergy. She traveled across state lines to get medical care, and the ministers and the abortion seekers all found that this journey was perilous. Restrictive laws, medical regulations, stigma, a scarcity of information, and untrustworthy providers were the lay of the land for abortion seekers and the increasing numbers of clergy who listened to their stories. And indeed, Howard Moody was not unique in his growing awareness of abortion restrictions and their consequences. In the 50s and early 60s, newspapers highlighted alarming statistics about hundreds of thousands of illegal abortions taking place annually. These articles showed the tremendous human costs of criminalizing abortion. Hospital wards filled with septic women, many others left damaged or dead from botched abortions. But for many clergy, these stories were not abstract. They were not just cautionary tales about other people's mothers or wives or daughters. They reflected what they were seeing firsthand among members of their own communities, their congregations, their close friends, and sometimes even their spouses. But the context in which clergy learned about abortion is fundamental to our story, and that context was pastoral counseling. Pastoral counseling was a practice that wove together religious guidance with therapeutic frameworks. And in the post-war era, pastoral counseling programs, institutions, and publications proliferated. And among mainline Protestants and liberal Jews, it created a platform with which to empower women. At a time when many experts proclaimed that women's roles should be limited to motherhood or homemaking, a growing cadre of pastoral counselors forcefully rejected what they called the practice of limiting women to domestic life. By the early 60s, articles in pastoral journals regularly centered women's quests for autonomy while criticizing what they called masculine arrogance for treating, their words, women as objects instead of human subjects. Now, even as they learned to empower women, these same pastoral counselors advanced sexually liberal ideas that separated sex from procreation and affirmed a right to sexual pleasure. To quote one representative article, sex was not to be seen as, quote, low and dirty and shameful, something to be hidden and despised, animal and beneath contempt, the source of man's weakness and evil. Instead, the goal was to lead the faithful to an acceptance, their words, of sex as a normal and natural part of human growth and personality development. Sexually liberal pastoral frameworks dovetailed with social justice commitments. Many of these same clergy emphasized faith in action. Most were members of the civil rights movement. And rabbis and ministers alike saw it as their duty to both bear witness to the systems inflicting suffering and inequality and to challenge those very systems. Primed by these pastoral and social justice frameworks, clergy counselors regularly encountered women who shared the everyday circumstances, from ordinary contraceptive failure to unplanned sex to sexual violence that led them to seek abortion. And they heard what happened when these women had illegal abortions. The Reverend Alden Hathaway, a Presbyterian minister in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, recalled, quote, "We began to see the human tragedy, stories of desperate women, suffering and bleeding in the filthy back alley butcher shops of downtown Detroit. The tragic consequences of illegal abortions made it increasingly clear to religious leaders that abortion restrictions were not preventing abortions. Instead, they were creating a public health crisis." So in the 1950s and early 1960s, a number of liberal Jewish rabbis informed by social justice commitments and mainline Protestant clergy inspired by the social gospel and both informed by pastoral counseling frameworks began to individually and collectively think about abortion laws as systematically inflicting suffering and violence upon women. An early watermark was in 1961 when the Christian Century, the leading journal of mainline Protestantism, called for a, quote, relaxing of those abortion laws which compel the bearing of children conceived through rape, incest, and irresponsibility by minor or mentally incompetent girls. In this very limited call for reform, the Christian Century broke away from Catholic leaders that opposed all abortions and the longstanding laws that only allowed abortions to save the life of a mother. That same year, the National Council of Churches, which was kind of an organizing body for mainline Protestants, issued a statement explaining that the topic of abortion needed additional study by Christian scholars. Now, when academics hear the words additional study, that's just a way of passing the buck down the line. But this was not, in fact, a set of empty words that would disappear. Individual churches, regional denominational bodies, and interfaith groups actively studied and debated abortion and abortion restrictions, and so did Jewish congregations and denominations. So while most Jewish and Protestant religious groups initially called for abortion law reform, carving small exceptions in the law, the scope of demands would expand rapidly. As state legislatures began reconsidering abortion restrictions, the quiet pastoral conversations that had been happening for years and years burst out into the open as religious organizations and leaders made expansive demands on behalf of women's autonomy. Here in Michigan, the Reverend Richard Morrison, a Methodist from Jackson, drew from his pastoral counseling experience and his understanding of the gospel to explain to legislators that abortion should be a private decision made by a woman and her physician. The Episcopal churchwomen of the Diocese of Michigan, meanwhile, denounced the state's abortion prohibitions as denying women's, quote, basic right of self-stewardship, and they urged the repeal of the abortion law. And Rabbi Leon Fromm, president of the Michigan Association of Reform Rabbis, decried Michigan's restrictions as failing to take, quote, account of modern knowledge or the human needs of contemporary humanity. He declared that in Judaism, before there is birth, the well-being of the mother and her rights of choice are the prime considerations. As these women-centered proclamations were becoming louder and more common, legislatures, especially in states where Catholic bishops wielded significant political clout, held the line against reform and repeal. Over in New York State, the dramatic failure of abortion law reform in 2 consecutive legislative sessions sparked fears among Protestant and Jewish clergy that had been gathering together in New York City to study abortion since the fall of 1966, that it might be years before legal reform would be enacted. And so, at the end of May of 1967, in the wake of the New York State's legislature's failure to reform its abortion laws, the front page of the New York Times announced a religious undertaking that was months in planning and decades in the making. This ecumenical group of clergy, resting upon their pastoral counseling ethos and commitments to social justice, announced that it would offer abortion counseling and referrals to any woman who asked for it. They called themselves the Clergy Consultation Service on Abortion, and their spokesman, Howard Moody, explained that amidst a public health crisis in which backstreet butchers were mutilating and killing women, clergy would break the law in order to help them get safe abortions. And their offer for help in nearly every case meant answering the crucial question that had haunted Howard Moody since 1956. Where do you go when you want a safe abortion? This brings us to the second part of our talk. The pastoral is political. Before 1967, as we just discussed, some clergy quietly helped women with unwanted pregnancies to obtain abortions. This pastoral counseling placed them in quiet conflict with the social norms and the laws governing abortion. But as the CCS spread to dozens of states, it self-consciously transformed pastoral counseling into an overt tool to effect social transformation. Now, early memos among the clergy, early memos said that they would extend the sanctity of the pastoral counseling relationship into the public square. And these pastoral efforts were meant to do more than just lend an aura of respectability or sanctity to abortion seekers. They also asserted a zone of legal privacy, allowing abortion seekers and clergy counselors to discuss what some states deemed illegal acts. CCS clergy, in other words, turned religious spaces into sanctuaries where abortion seekers, especially in states that prohibited the sharing of abortion information, could learn how to terminate a pregnancy. Through the CCS, hundreds of churches and synagogues across the continent became launch pads for women who, in the course of pastoral counseling, often gained personal and religious affirmation, but at the very least, religious leaders offered pregnant women a series of choices on how to handle their pregnancies. Now, for those who decided upon abortion, they received medical information, abortion referral, and travel advice before they embarked on their journeys. Let me spell out what I mean by returning to the urgent questions that abortion seekers had difficulty answering and that drove them to seek clergy help. How can I end my pregnancy? Where can I obtain an abortion? How will I get there? Can I trust the provider? Can I afford the procedure? What do I do if something goes wrong? Whereas in 1956, it was difficult for Reverend Moody and countless abortion seekers to answer these questions, the CCS devoted itself to mapping, expanding, and regulating what had largely been an unstable and dangerous international abortion market. What did this look like? Well, first, it meant compiling a directory of providers, what they called resources. Then, it meant evaluating the quality and credentials of abortion providers. Clergy, doctors, and nurses affiliated with the CCS traveled to visit these physicians. They often posed as pregnant women to assess their bedside manner, the cleanliness of the clinic, and every aspect of the procedure. And once a CCS branch had identified a reliable source, they would then share this information amongst each other to see whether the doctor had acquired a bad reputation. If the provider passed muster, then CCS branches would begin making referrals. The difficulty was that reliable providers in the United States were few and far between, and the demand for abortion far outstripped the capacities of the few CCS-approved providers in the continental United States. And so clergy retraced long-standing but informal abortion routes to the territory of Puerto Rico and to Mexico, even as they utilized religious pathways to Canada and Japan. Many clergy in the CCS were comfortable working within and across national borders because their denominational, interfaith, and missionary efforts already circled the globe. Protestant missionary efforts in Japan, for example, led to the founding of a CCS branch in Tokyo and created conduits for American abortion seekers to go to Japan, which had legalized abortion in 1948. The proximity of Detroit to Windsor, Ontario, saw the close collaboration of clergy on both sides of the border and the flow of abortion seekers across the Ambassador Bridge. Meanwhile, Unitarian religious networks formed the connective tissue between abortion providers and seekers in central Canada and the northeastern United States. By early 1968, CCS branches had established abortion travel routes from the mainland United States to Canada, Japan, Mexico, and Puerto Rico, transforming a historically dangerous and illegal undertaking into a routine process. When England legalized abortion in 1967 and made the service available to non-residents in 1968, London became an international abortion destination and was quickly added to the CCS roster. By the end of 1969, the clergy abortion referral network spanned 5 countries on 3 continents. Which brings us to travel itself. Now, you have to remember, and many of you might, that in an era before smartphones and TripAdvisor and a GPS and Yelp, traveling was not easy. And I can tell you about my travel journeys last night. They're still not easy. But abortion travel in particular was logistically demanding and filled with potential dangers. And many folks who found the CCS had never left their hometowns or their home states, let alone traveled internationally. Consequently, an essential aspect of the CCS's pastoral care was helping travelers to navigate its transcontinental network. To that end, they produced guidebooks with titles like A Guide to Mexico City and Procedure for Referral to London. Now, these mimeographed sheets of paper, which included step-by-step travel instructions, taught women how to get a passport, a travel visa, where to purchase airline tickets, where to pick up luggage, which flights to take, where to exchange money, where to stay overnight, what to say and how to pay the doctor, what to expect during the procedure, and how to care for themselves before, during, and after their abortions. These tips exemplified pastoral care. They were material attempts to orient inexperienced travelers to new geographies and cultures, to explain medical procedures, and most importantly, to lessen their clients' stress and fears as they actualized their reproductive choices. This is from the Lansing Area Guidebook. Now, the CCS's advice to abortion seekers often emulated American tourist guidebooks, even as they conveyed American assumptions about hospitality. This Lansing Area multi-page guide to London, for example, repeatedly griped about British food. Salads and coffee are to be avoided in England as they are usually poor. Wimpy bars are an English version of the big boy, but worse. The same guides also bitterly complained about British heating practices and advised packing extra sweaters. From another CCS guide to Mexico, travelers learned to, quote, avoid raw fruits, vegetables, and tap water. Bottled water is usually satisfactory. To be absolutely safe, drink Coke. And still other guides listed restaurants and recommended favorite places to stay and dine. Now, this feedback may sound a little silly to our ears, but it spoke to the CCS's understanding of the intertwined nature of healthcare, travel guidance, and pastoral care. And because abortion travel was so expensive, so very expensive and daunting for so many women, abortion travelers especially appreciated these insights. Now, if CCS guides help travelers access practical comforts, they also cataloged the many, many dangers that women might encounter when crossing borders for abortion. For example, an abortion seeker guided by the CCS would learn how to interact with customs agents, and border guards, who were a constant source of concern for clergy and women because they harassed female travelers, especially those found carrying post-operative antibiotics. They sought to protect women's privacy and dignity during border crossings, and they advised travelers how to answer invasive questions by officials, noting things like, quote, "If a woman is asked whether she went to Mexico for an abortion, she is not required to answer. She should be prepared to look totally surprised." But border officials were only the first obstacle travelers had to face. Clergy also emphasized the need for discretion, especially when taking taxis. Behind this advice were women's numerous encounters with predatory taxi drivers who made money from diverting them to other abortion providers. And CCS guides were incredibly detailed, listing the fares, which taxi companies to use and which to avoid, and sometimes they even reviewed the routes in advance during counseling sessions. But it was the doctors. It was the doctors that worried them the most. Because abortion was illegal and carried so much stigma, those seeking abortions were especially vulnerable to abuse, to humiliation, to exploitation. And it was within this context of vulnerability that the CCS attempted to empower women. Clergy coached them on what to expect from providers and primed them to advocate for themselves. They also asked women to report back on every aspect of their experience. The CCS's negative list, its internally circulated list of doctors that could not be trusted or used, was a result of this reporting system. These negative lists, which had short descriptors of providers like butcher, avoid at all costs, or filthy, dirty, expensive, avoid, warned away clergy and travelers from danger. Each of these simple and concise warnings came at a tremendous human cost. For example, a 1968 memo from the New Jersey CCS instructed clergy counselors to put a Dr. Moxa from Puerto Rico on the negative list, quote, "for taking risks with the life of a patient, for making passes at a patient, for making girls wait for 3 to 5 days before the operation, and for charging inconsistent fees." Subsequent negative lists appearing in Lansing simply had 3 words next to Moxa's name. Bad news, avoid. Just 3 words separated by a semicolon contained a tragic experience and a bitter truth. Any safe passage in the context of criminalization was hard-won and based on the experiences of women who were constantly canaries in coal mines. Women who used the CCS, just like the clergy themselves, found few perfect options within a system that criminalized and stigmatized their activity. Nevertheless, the CCS wanted women to think of themselves as medical consumers, as experts about their bodies, as advocates. And in response to the CCS's invitations for feedback, many women gladly offered tips and advice, writing voluminous letters that fill archives with ideas on how to improve every aspect of the service. Feedback ranged from restaurant reviews to commentary on providers' bedside manners to practical suggestions like bringing along sanitary pads. And these suggestions often found their way into counseling sessions and revised versions of the CCS guidebook. Such letters written by abortion travelers to the CCS showcased women's own rising expectations for effective, accessible, and compassionate medical treatment abroad and increasingly at home. This brings us to our concluding section, travel as transformative. As CCS branches referred thousands of clients to providers, they gained economic leverage. You can think of them like a Costco. They were wholesale buyers, lowering prices. And abortion providers increasingly competed for CCS referrals. And to win these referrals, they lowered prices, they modified their medical, interpersonal, and hospitality practices, all to meet clergy specifications which were informed by women's demands. And all of this was possible because abortion was big business, and the CCS, which was a nonprofit broker, leveraged the group's vast purchasing power. Through the CCS, tens of thousands of women, armed with information and buoyed with expectations for competent and compassionate treatment, left home for days at a time for a surgery that often took less than 15 minutes to perform. And traveling for a procedure deemed shameful at home, these women, for the most part, found dignified treatment even as they fueled a multi-million-dollar medical and travel business. Now, it's impossible to know the extent to which traveling with the CCS reshaped women's public attitudes towards unwanted pregnancy and abortion. But letters written to the CCS reveal that the experience of working with them and of navigating the abortion underground became a form of collective consciousness raising for abortion seekers. Women using the CCS networks traveled together on airplanes, on buses, on trains. The Lansing CCS even prearranged for them to meet in advance and then travel across the country or globe together. And once they crossed borders, abortion seekers stayed together in hotels, sat together in clinic waiting rooms, commiserated over meals. These collective experiences contributed to some women's changing attitudes about unwanted pregnancy and abortion. The shared stories helped remove the stigma and the solitude. It helped women informally discover that their so-called personal problems were in fact collective structural problems that needed collective solutions. And though their journey started off individually, through talking with an affirming clergy, many abortion seekers came to a collective awareness of the limitations of abortion laws, the limitations of medical services, and they gained the power to name these conditions as unjust. What some women found at the end of their journeys was a feeling of anger about how unnecessarily difficult it was to obtain an abortion at home. And some channeled that anger into changing local laws. Their frustration was harnessed by religious activists who, even as they helped these women travel abroad, worked very vigorously to effect change at home, especially when police and prosecutors threatened their activity, which brings us back to Michigan in 1970, when a local prosecutor, in an attempt to stop the abortion referrals of the CCS, caused police in Illinois and Michigan to raid the offices of Rabbi Tickton. This is the search warrant. As news of the raid spread, CCS clergy in Illinois and Michigan, alongside of numerous religious organizations, rallied around the rabbi. The Chicago Board of Rabbis defended Tickton as, quote, a moral leader of great integrity, even as the Detroit Council of Churches decried the state's abortion law. CCS members also loudly protested the police action. Speaking to reporters, the CCS clergy emphasized women's rights to personal, medical, and religious privacy. They underscored their own religious right to counsel women and their commitment to assisting them seek out safe abortions. Signaling the militant spirit among CCS clergy and the broad interfaith support for abortion rights, the Reverend Robert F. Marshall of the Birmingham Unitarian Universalist Church and a member of the Michigan CCS wrote an open letter to the prosecutor that spotlighted the broad consensus that viewed restrictive abortion laws as an immoral imposition on women's rights and religious freedom. He wrote, "If you really intend to prosecute clergymen for abortion counseling, you have tackled quite a bunch. You will have to jail every rabbi in Oakland County, every Unitarian cleric, at least half of the Protestant clergy, and even a few Catholic priests. In the name of law enforcement, you have performed a very wicked deed." Marshall's letter emphasized women's activism. He wrote, "In a matter of a year or two, Michigan will have a law comparable to the new abortion laws in California, Colorado, North Carolina, and others. In every one of these states, it was clergymen plus women's church groups, and I would add Jewish synagogue groups too, which pushed for legislation. And indeed, in the days following the raid on Rabbi Tickton's office, the Michigan prosecutor met with a gathering of 250 Unitarian Universalist women who loudly jeered him and confronted him for supporting what they called an archaic and inhuman law. Now here's where the story takes a turn. In response to this outpouring of anger, the prosecutor too declared that it was time to revise Michigan's abortion law. Supportive politicians in Illinois and Michigan meanwhile pressured the prosecutor to drop the charges against Tickton, and these efforts quickly added up. By the end of January, the attorney announced that his office somehow just didn't have the funds to pursue the case against Tickton. And he also said, very publicly, that Tickton had acted in the highest humanitarian tradition. More, the branches of the CCS in both Michigan and Illinois didn't stop counseling even when the heat was on them. Rather, they continued their efforts, and by 1973 were two of the biggest and most organized branches of the CCS in the United States. But I want to note that the deference given to clergy did not extend to abortion providers. Prosecutors and police pursued charges against Dr. Jesse Ketchum, who was problematic for a number of reasons that I can talk about. But they shuttered his practice until a lower court decision temporarily overturned Michigan's abortion law. And even then, police and prosecutors kept pursuing him with new charges, eventually driving him out of Michigan. Now, these court battles around Ketchum dovetailed with a multi-year legal, legislative, and finally a referendum effort in 1972 to overturn the state's restrictions, an effort that remained unrealized until Roe. So, broader significances. As we think about this history of pastoral counseling and abortion travel from our own moment of new legal restrictions and state-sponsored medical scarcity, I want to note that even as these clergy affirmed over and over and over that reproductive choice was sacred, the backdrop to every phone call to the CCS, the setting for every counseling session, the framework for every trip to an abortion provider, and the impetus to challenge hostile state officials were the legal, the religious, and the medical apparatuses that systematically denied those who became pregnant the ability to easily and safely control their bodies and their futures. It's been over 55 years since the founding of the CCS. Someday, one abortion seeker wrote to a CCS minister in 1968, perhaps this country will be more liberalized and will put an end to so many of the tragedies that arise when girls are in this predicament. But that is in the future. That future, imagined more than half a century ago, has not yet arrived. But remembering a history of religious compassion and activism can perhaps blunt the force of the repeated claim made by those who oppose abortion that they somehow represent a one true religion. And the CCS's history of compassionate counseling and civil disobedience might yet offer a usable past. Members of the CCS and the many religious groups that supported them, after all, invited others to act boldly, to achieve a world in which women could make their own moral choices and to be stewards of their own bodies and their futures. Thank you.
I'm just going to slide you over for just a second. Thank you so much for a really fantastic lecture. I really learned so much. We're so grateful to it. So we want to invite Q&A. We just want to ask, if you want to ask a question, to please come up and speak into the microphone so everyone can hear you, and so it will come out in the recording. So please, are there any questions? Yeah, please come on up, Amy. And if you want to introduce yourself before you speak, that'd be awesome.
Hello. Is this okay?
Is that on, Bob?
Should I just speak loudly? So, thank you. This is great, and I have so many questions, but I'll just keep it to one. I'm Amy Daragatis, and I'm a professor in religious studies here at Michigan State. So, have you had the chance to investigate what the conservative co-religionists are doing at the same time? And, you know, I'm thinking about the therapeutic language also being harnessed for other types of counseling that might be going on with the more conservative religious groups. I'm just curious if they're interacting with each other, responding to each other, or completely ignoring each other.
They're not completely ignoring each other. They're in close dialogue. And what we see is actually a broad consensus, particularly in states where evangelicals are active in the CCS. So you get down to places like Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina. On the rosters are evangelicals. Now, part of the condition for their participation is the differing meanings of abortion. Therapeutic abortion was by and large acceptable. Therapeutic abortion was by and large acceptable to evangelicals who were comfortable with it so long as people deemed worthy of the procedure could access it. And that deeming of worthiness mostly just meant doctors would decide, or clergy would decide, or the state would decide. It wouldn't be what was called abortion on demand. But even within certain groups, there was discussion and difference over who was worthy and the meaning of abortion. And that is sort of was a subject for debate that became much more pronounced after 1970, when New York State made abortion on demand possible and made these sort of theoretical conversations into concrete ones, and people had to reckon with abortion seekers who didn't just come once but multiple times, and what was the morality of that. So there was intra-religious conversations about it, but what we saw was, at least until 70, a broad consensus forming around the need to access it. Now, the primary driver, as I gestured to in my talk, was there was a body count, and the body count was women. And so they saw this as a profoundly urgent intervention when there was hundreds of thousands of people endangering themselves. Once the medical danger was no longer quite as present, the stakes shifted. So that's how I would frame that answer.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, Gil. Nice to see you.
Hi, Sharon.
I'm Sharon Leon. I'm in the history department. So I have a question that's kind of similar to Amy's, in that I'm wondering if you have evidence of interaction between the Clergy Consultation Service and religious organizations of physicians across the geography that you're looking at, because there's certainly big Catholic physicians organizations, and I assume that that's true for Jewish physicians and for mainline Protestants.
Yes, the short answer is yes. They were harnessing them. They were often harnessing physicians within their own denominations, their own congregations, and enlisting them as providers. And they were working with various religious medical groups to gain their support. And so in the run-ups to liberalization efforts in states across the country, you would see in the signatories of people advocating for reform in particular, the names of various medical religious organizations. Now, unsurprisingly, Catholic medical religious organizations were at the foreground of opposition to it, but then you would see what we might call secular, but we could also just say other religious groups belonging to other medical organizations, lending their name and authority to it. It's in places like Pennsylvania, for example, this was very pronounced among Jewish physicians who not only lent their names to it, but quite literally opened up hospitals, making abortion local, if sort of technically legal.
Great, thank you.
Excuse me, sorry. Thank you so much. I'm sorry, we're actually going to need to cut Q&A short. I did not have my phone with me and did not see what time it was, but we're thrilled to be able to have our next speaker, Representative Elissa Slotkin, here. So hold questions, and maybe we can answer them after she's had a chance and Dana Nessel's had a chance to speak. But we just want to welcome Elissa Slotkin, and we have someone to introduce her. Thank you so much for coming.
Hi, thank you for a fantastic lecture, Gillian. So Representative Elissa Slotkin is currently in her second term as Congresswoman of the 8th District, and she's our representative here in Ingham County, so at MSU. Yay! She served in the Central Intelligence Agency as a Middle East analyst, serving and advising our military on militias there on 3 different tours in Iraq, and between those tours she worked for the Bush administration and Obama administration, in the White House for intelligence, in the Office of Director of the National Intelligence. Since 2011, she worked on the Pentagon, and then in January 2017, she started serving as the Acting Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. We were really honored to have Representative Slotkin 2 years ago. She did an event with us with Representative Bretta Lawrence on the talking about their work on the Black Jewish Congressional Caucus, and talking about the film Shared Legacies, about the work between Jews and African Americans during the Civil Rights Movement. And she also has done a couple forums on anti-Semitism here in the area, which we've worked with as well. And then I teach at James Madison College as well as directing the Sterling Institute, and we've really been honored to have Representative Slotkin speak at, I think, several of our graduations, and also this week on serving in a public affairs capacity. So we really have a great already relationship with you, and we're so honored to have you here with us today. Thank you.
Well, hello, everybody. Lovely to see you. Thanks for having me. And I have the honor of being the Jewish member of Congress who represents the fewest Jews in the country. You guys are you're keeping the torch alive here. We've got about 4,000 in and across the East Lansing area, but I represent the 8th District, which is right now Ingham County, Livingston County, so Brighton and Howell, and then North Oakland County, all the way through Rochester and Rochester Hills. I think it's great what you're doing and great what the topic is. I hope I'm not going to be repetitive, but I just thought it would be useful to have a conversation given how relevant the issue of choice is and actually how fundamental the Jewish community is to fighting back against the ban on or the disregarding of Roe v. Wade. That I think it's a great topic. I was here with Brenda Lawrence a couple of years ago, or we were on Zoom, I guess we should say. We were on Zoom, so it's much better to be in person. I would say I've been in Congress for 4 years now, and it's been a tumultuous 4 years. It's been a pretty crazy 4 years. I didn't run for Congress because I thought it was all going great. So I knew what I was getting into. But I think the issue of choice has really galvanized this area in a way that I have not seen with any other issue. I must say that the 8th District in general polls as a pro-life district. Here in Ingham County, it's sort of a little bit of a bubble, but you get outside of Ingham County, and the average person in this district identifies as pro-life who believes in some exceptions. That's how they would describe themselves. And I knew things were very, very different when the leak happened on the Roe decision back in May. And that next day, I was getting on a plane to go to D.C. from Detroit, sitting next to two strangers. They recognized me, and they didn't know each other either, strike up a conversation. One of them is a woman who was a former Republican elected justice here in Michigan, a Supreme Court justice, retired. And the other one is a self-identified pro-life mom and business owner. And they brought the issue up with me. And I would just say, has anyone ever had a stranger on a plane raise abortion with them? It's like the last topic that you should bring up on a plane. And they both said what I feel like has become the mantra for this region, which is they said, look, I'm pro-life. I could never personally have an abortion. This is about my relationship with God, and I'm Catholic. I don't think that it's right. I couldn't advise my children to have an abortion. But I've never walked in another woman's shoes and wouldn't tell another woman how to live. And that's all we're asking for here in Michigan, right, where we have this 1931 ban. The other theme that I feel very strongly, and this will sound very familiar to you all since we're so close to the Capitol, is if you think about what's been going on in Michigan for the past 2 years with protests and armed protesters going into our Capitol and all the protests against the COVID lockdowns and just all, watching January 6th, all of that. We've basically been having a 2-year conversation on the role of personal freedom in our state. Do you have the personal freedom to not wear a mask, to not be vaccinated, to go get your hair cut when, the governor shuts down, getting your hair cut? We've been having that conversation. And I think women, it is not lost on us that the very same people who've been preaching personal freedom for 2 years are the first ones to turn around and say that women shouldn't get the right to decide their own personal freedom. So, that was brought home to me when all these little protests erupted in small little towns like Holly, Michigan, where my family farm is. I was just going to the CVS right after the Roe decision was leaked. And there's a protest at our major intersection in Holly, which is a very brave thing to do in a small conservative town. And what signs and sort of posters were they holding up? It wasn't kind of that very politicized, get out of my uterus, very sort of Washington kind of language. It was a picture of the coiled snake, the Marine Corps snake, and it was "Don't tread on me," that personal freedom angle, which I thought was very much of Michigan, and why I feel very strongly that even in this pro-life district, Proposition 3 is going to pass, and overwhelmingly. So I feel good about that. I will say the thing that I started looking up, I'm sure like many of you, was how do Jewish people, how does the state of Israel, how does our religion look on the issue of choice? And I don't know, stop me if you all have gone through this today, but it was actually super, super interesting to me because, I'm just skipping ahead here, because this is a religious freedom issue for Jewish people and a lot of other religions who have sacred texts that talk about abortion and actually permit it. And I think the thing that I watched happening was we've seen communities, particularly Jewish communities, particularly in Florida, who have really taken up the mantle from a legal perspective and saying, if the Supreme Court doesn't seem to care about women's rights, why don't we look about religious freedom and trying to push cases through the courts, up through the courts. It's a long-term strategy, but push it up through the courts with this angle of religious freedom. And so just so we're all on the same page, because I thought this was super interesting, their legal argument has three pieces to it. One, that Jewish law gives the life of the mother precedence over the life of the fetus. In fact, Jewish sources explicitly state that abortion is not only permitted, but is required should the pregnancy endanger the life of the mother. Okay. Second, in Jewish tradition, the child is not considered a child until it leaves the womb and until it can take its own breath on its own. You know, breath is life, and if it can't take its own breath, then it is not considered a child. And the Talmud refers to the fetus as, quote, mere fluid in the earliest stages, and it's not considered life until it leaves a pregnant person's body, right? It's actually very clear in religious texts from what I understand. I'm no scholar, but... and then lastly, the Torah specifically states that Jewish law does not consider a fetus to have the same status as a person. So it can't be murdered because it doesn't have the status of a human being. And importantly also, what health of the mother is in Jewish tradition is not just physical health, but also psychological health, mental health, which is very, very important, and which is why denying women access to be able to terminate a pregnancy does actually contradict Jewish law, very old Jewish law. So these are the arguments that are being put forward in this court case in Florida. There's a group in Ohio that is also now, I don't know if it's a separate case or if they're joining on this case, but I just think it's super interesting. And they are stating that this new law threatens the Jewish people by imposing the laws of other religions upon Jews. The other thing that I think is extremely instrumental is, let's look at Israel, right? Israel allows abortion. And actually, when they saw us overturning Roe, they took action. And the week after, I mean, I think they had something already going, but I don't know if it's coincidental, but the week after the Dobbs decision came down and we officially overturned Roe v. Wade, in Israel, in the Knesset, the Israeli parliament voted to expand women's access to abortion. So what it was a year ago was that if you had wanted to terminate a pregnancy, you had to sit in front of a panel of a couple of doctors and a social worker. But still, I mean, not an experience that I would personally advocate for our country, but what ended up happening is basically every time a woman went in front of this panel and she had a child out of wedlock, they almost always supported her getting an abortion. Certainly for life of the mother, health of the mother, psychological health of the mother. So it wasn't necessarily a comfortable process, but they still allowed abortion, unlike what we have now in some states. With this new change that they literally made right around the time the Dobbs decision came through, so July, was now they do not have to sit in front of that panel. They can apply online, and they can almost always get an answer to their petition online without having to come and sit in front of a panel. In very rare cases, they still may have to come in front of that panel of doctors and social workers, but it made it easier. And it basically said that women shouldn't have to. We are removing barriers for women to terminate a pregnancy, not adding barriers, which is, of course, what's going on in our country. And according to their own data, the Israeli government data, about 98% of the abortions that were sought were given, right? So think about how different that is than what we're going through right now. And we're happy that they don't have to go through sort of the humiliating questions that they had at the panel. They were known for grilling women, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's, unfortunately, Israel took us as a cautionary tale. And they looked at us and said, oh boy, we better not have, that kind of same extreme activity happen here. Let's go ahead and enshrine in law some things that we want, and henceforth they have done it. Obviously, for us in Michigan, I just want to appreciate that our choice organizations in this state had their crap together. And we should all really thank them for that, because the national organizations did not. And I want to be clear about that too. The only way we get better is if we acknowledge our own failings and then do something about it. And right after the Dobbs decision was leaked in May, I called all the major national organizations and I said, what's the plan, right? Like, when do I see the press conference with every choice organization lined up and behind the podium with like the Capitol behind you? Are we going to protest the day after the decision comes down? Like, what is the plan? And I would deign to say that very few of us still know what the federal plan is, right? I voted on this. I voted on codifying Roe and more beyond, like many, many times. But what is the federal plan? So because I couldn't get an answer out of that, I called the new head of Michigan Planned Parenthood. She's wonderful, Paula. And I said, please tell me there's a plan. This was back in May. And indeed, we had a plan, because 2 years ago, some very astute watchers of our political system knew that in the state of Michigan, we had a 1931 ban, and that if we ever lost Roe, we were going to be screwed here. And so they started working on the legal language for the ballot initiative long before we were all worried about this issue. In November of last year, so almost exactly a year ago, when we knew the Dobbs decision had been, or the Dobbs case had been accepted, they went into overdrive and had already started collecting signatures. Probably most of you had not heard of that petition until May, because of course the May decision just supercharged everything, and we got nearly 800,000 signatures in 8 weeks, right? But the only reason we have it on the ballot is because it was ready, because we plan. And I think if there's one message I would leave you with, as a Jewish community who is dealing with, let's be honest, a rise in anti-Semitism in our country, with people who care about the rights of women, and let's be honest, things are going in the wrong direction on that. The only way to actually counteract that, it's not posting on social media, it's not being like, rah, rah, I really care about these issues. It's actually taking action and demanding that the organizations you're a part of have a plan. And if the leaders of your organization can't articulate a plan, you need to agitate for one, because we just don't live in an era where it's okay and safe and easy to just say, like, it'll all work itself out. No, that's not the era we live in. So I will leave you with that. Thank you for having me, and thank you for bringing up this really great topic.
Wow, thank you so much, Representative Slotkin. Hi, my name is Thora Yaris. I'm Assistant Professor of Jewish Studies in the Religious Studies Department. I'm here at MSU, one of the co-organizers of this event. We're really thrilled that in a little while we'll be welcoming Attorney General Dana Nessel. She's running a little bit late. She's on her way. In the meantime, our wonderful first speaker, Gil Frank, has agreed to take some of your questions that we weren't able to get to when he first started doing his Q&A. So Gil, the podium is yours. Folks, if you have questions, invite you to the mic in the middle of the room.
I don't think I've ever followed a wonderful politician, let alone any politician before.
Talked a lot about consumer. You talked about how expensive this was. I'm curious if all of these rabbis and priests were, rabbis and ministers were from more wealthy congregations. I'm wondering if there were efforts to raise funds. I'm wondering how finances played a role in what you described, in the networks that you described.
Sure, and since we're trying to buy a little time here, I'll talk a little capaciously about this. Okay, so when the CCS started, abortions typically ranged between $500 to $1,000. You can adjust that for inflation, and that's in the tens of thousands of dollars today. It's a lot of money. That's not counting the travel costs and whatever, and you couldn't get a guarantee of the product you were buying. By the time New York legalized abortion and the CCS established its own clinic over there, you heard that right, they established their own clinic, abortion costs dropped to $125. So that is a precipitous drop. And again, that had to do with wholesale buying, but also controlling the sort of resources themselves. Even before we saw legalization, the subsequent organization of the network and organization of travelers started reducing the costs precipitously, so that it went from $1,000 or $750 first to $500 and then to $250. Still very expensive. Many people couldn't afford it. And so they started coming up with buying plans. For every 5 people we send you, you give a 6th one free. And so they negotiated that sort of cost as a kind of consumer advocacy. They also raised funds and used slush funds within congregations. I believe it was the Presbyterians, from a wealthy donor, organized a sort of national emergency travel fund. Individual Unitarian congregations had slush funds. And Jewish rabbis in particular were very good about raising funds to send people out of state or out of country. In places like Nebraska, they went to Warren Buffett's wife, Susie Buffett, who personally basically wrote checks to them to help people travel across the country for abortions. So there was many means of helping them. But for the most part, working class women, poorer women were excluded unless they could get access to this. And this was the sort of ceiling of the access. Until legalization happened, making it local and accessible, costs remained comparatively high, not just for the procedures, but for the travel. And so while there was attempts at remediation, I have numerous letters from clergy and organizers and the women who sought help from them saying the costs are too prohibitive. And one of the organizers reflected a few years after it was over, the thing that we saw with thousands of women again and again and again was, aside from the many conditions by which they became unwillingly pregnant, was they could not afford the procedure. That was it.
Hi, I'm Sarah Shakeman. I'm an international relations major, and I personally really wanted to ask about how exactly the CCS was able to forge kind of connections with Tokyo, Japan, especially because it's to my understanding that in Japan, Christianity and Judaism aren't exactly very large sects. So I'm wondering if what they did is that they worked with other religious leaders in Japan, or if it was just abortion clinics they were working with.
Absolutely. So that is a great question. The Japan story is fascinating. So Japan legalizes abortion in 1948. It's part of a broader history of contraception and abortion in the post-war period, and part of a broader theory that circulated among Japanese leaders that said that one of the things that caused World War II was overpopulation. We can get into the sort of messiness and ugliness of that theory, but the net effect was that abortion became legalized, and if you could travel internationally, you could get an abortion there, so long as you could, A, afford the plane fare, B, afford the cost of the abortion, and C, navigate the foreign language and get from the airport to the clinic and ask for the procedure. So in 1968, a minister by the name of Hugh Anwell out in California with connections to Japanese ministers, or missionaries, excuse me, goes over there and says, I need your help. We need to get people from the West Coast, particularly those who are a second trimester, access to an abortion. Will you help us? And he rounded up about 20 ministers out there, or basic missionaries, some who weren't ordained, and they founded a group whose sole function was get women from the airport to the clinic, sit with them, and comfort them. So it was a connection both with American missionaries abroad, for the most part, and Japanese physicians. And this was a slim percentage of the people who traveled abroad because of the time, the cost, the language barriers. So, but Japan became an outpost, a small one, but certainly an outpost.
I'm Stan Kaplowitz. I'm Professor Emeritus of Sociology here, and my question is this. You talked about the role of the Catholic Church in opposing abortion. Mm-hmm. I don't recall you saying anything much about conservative evangelicals, but by 1980, it's very clear that they were very much into it, and which brought about, Reagan becoming anti-abortion. Sure. So can you talk about the process by which they went from relatively inactive to being at least as fiercely anti-abortion as the Catholic Church?
Yes, it's a great question, and it's the subject of a historiographical debate that I'm actually embroiled in. So, all right. Evangelicals were divided about the meaning of abortion amongst themselves, right? Different groups had different perspectives, and even with in the same denominations broadly, there was arguments about it. But for the most part, evangelicals pre-1970, so pre-New York legalization, could get on board with therapeutic abortion. So there's two definitions of abortion at play here: abortion reform and abortion repeal. Abortion reform says controlled predominantly by male physicians and the state, and given to the worthy. Southern Baptist Conference could get on board with that. Various other groups could get on board with that. The second option was abortion repeal. Women choose, they're the arbiters of their own moral judgments. We get the state out of the question except to regulate health, and that was much more of a touchy issue. So what happens around 1972? The first thing is that Nixon campaigns around abortion. Evangelicals are already deeply divided, but the voices around opposing it are growing increasingly loud. That said, there's still a consensus among official organs that we're on board with therapeutic abortions. With Roe the next year, and abortion is already supercharged with the 72 election, the meaning of it changes. It's no longer a question of therapeutic abortion. The meaning of it becomes abortion on demand. Now, the other catalyst for this, and this is where evangelicals are learning that abortion threatens the family and proper gender roles and hierarchies, is the ERA. Now, the Equal Rights Amendment, which is actually supercharging all sorts of debates about gender and sexuality, Phyllis Schlafly and others, deeply rooted in Catholic theologies and beliefs, are on the ground stripping away Catholic references from anti-abortion literature, as well as anti-gay literature and all sorts of other things, and basically sharing it with anti-choice evangelical groups. And they're Catholicizing evangelical beliefs. So over the next 7 years, as which the ERA battles are going state by state, evangelicals are being exposed to a steady diet of Catholic thought without the Catholic markers. There's a wonderful scholar named Neil J. Young who talks about this extensively. But that politicization takes place, I mean, it seems like a brief window of time, like, about 8 years, but it's inundation. So that sort of happens. By 80, the terrain shifts. There's the conservative capture of the Southern Baptist Conference, and so forth. So that's more or less how it happens. Okay. Broad brushstrokes.
Thank you very much.
I'll assume it was something I said.
Hi, my name's Cooper Sackett. I'm a student here. So my question is given recent events with Dobbs v. Women's Health, do you foresee in states that have now banned or limited abortion to more select individuals, do you see organizations like the CCS coming back to help these women receive abortions?
Historians are terrible prognosticators. But, but to your question, religious groups are already active. They were active in the amicus briefs. They continue to be active on the ground. There's groups like Faith in Women, Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice, Faith Choice Ohio, and so on. National Council of Jewish Women, of course, has been a powerful leader who are trying to mobilize not only sort of funds for abortion travel, but also to transform laws, issue court challenges, and yes, help people get the services they need. So it's already happening. It's not called the CCS. What will happen in the next months, years, is unclear. But liberal religious activism just never went away, and we're seeing a resurgence of it as people are deeply discomforted by what has happened.
No, this isn't a question. It's more of a kind of what do you think, and maybe opening it up to the group too, to get you off the hook. But I find myself so frustrated by the way so often now in our culture, liberal religious actors are not seen as having this kind of voice, and that the voice of the religious response for something like reproductive justice is always a conservative voice. And that might not reflect, well, you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Right. And I just, like, what needs to happen to change that kind of branding?
Okay.
And that's for everybody, to that you don't always think that the religious response to losing reproductive rights is going to be a conservative response.
I want to hear what other people think, but I'll say a few things specific to academia, then specific to pop culture. Historians of the U.S. are religiously illiterate for the most part, and they are. It's not in the canon of what is taught during comps. American religious history tends not to live in that space. American studies, which was my home discipline, was religious phobic for the most part. And I think that many Americans in general are religiously illiterate. They don't have a sense. Same with journalists who don't have a very, this is being recorded, I should watch this. Who I would invite to consult with religious studies professors and to think more clearly and in nuanced ways about how to use words like religions and to think about it as religious debates rather than capital R religion. So what has happened, and I'm just sort of going to explain why the story I'm telling might seem strange to so many of you, is that much of the histories of abortion, as particularly the backlashes against abortion rights, were written after the rise of the religious right by historians, many of whom did not have solid religious training and took conservative activists at their word about the religious landscape. The historiography has been shaped by that. And so when I looked for the CCS after discovering it in an archive, what did I find? Pithy descriptions, marginalia, and absence. Or hagiographies written by fans, which is great, right? Captured a lot of good things. But when I went to look for an explanation, because my mind was blown when I first encountered them in the archives in Ann Arbor, what did it mean that clergy came to Lansing and were also helping people go out of state? How do I square that with what I thought capital R religion was? My background was, personal background was Jewish. This seemed so foreign to me. And then I began digging and realized that they were in fact part of a mainstream conversation and exerted clout. Why couldn't other historians see it? And why, when it appeared in the media, was it perpetually surprising? The early story was the Catholic Church had a very savvy, and by that I mean Catholic institutional leaders. We need to differentiate the Catholic Church in various ways. Very savvy media operation for much of the 20th century that allowed them to convince journalists that their view on sex and reproduction was the dominant view. So even when mainline Protestants and Jews spoke and said, no, we have alternative views, they were always an alternative choice and an alternative voice, even with the hegemony of Protestants. It was just the way the narrative unspooled in public. And so that allowed for simultaneous forgetting of liberal religious thought, decline of mainline Protestant attendance, as well as if you go to a synagogue on a Friday night or a Saturday, a lot of empty chairs in the room, right? Institutional liberal religion is sparsely populated. And so there's a lot of things shaping the ways in which anti-choice folks have been able to claim capital R religion and convince from their own large podiums, others with large podiums, that this is the story of faith and reproduction. And so when I tell these stories about hundreds of thousands of women getting abortions through religious organizations, and in 1973, Howard Moody could look across and say, there's no Protestant that really opposes abortion anymore. He wasn't quite right about that. But from his vantage point in New York City, there was a consensus that was forgotten in the eve of it as louder voices went on. But also as clergy who were part of this group thought that the law was the final way of settling this, that it would be just like in their ideas, the Civil Rights Act, which they naively thought settled it, right? And so they went on to other, clergy are always overwhelmed. They always have a new cause. And Roe settled it for them, many of them. That's sort of what happened. So that's my long way of answering. It's not quite a declension narrative, it's more of a dispersion narrative. But I mean, these are conversations that can be had in your own synagogues, in your own congregations, in your own churches. They should be.
killing time. I have a question. So I'm Matt Pauly. I'm also in the history department, but not a historian of the United States. So I may be straying into territory that I don't fully understand. But to echo Amy's question, I mean, it seems to me that what strikes me as different between Catholicism and Reform Judaism and mainline Protestant churches is the clergy don't exist without the congregation. I mean, that's true for Catholicism as well, but the clergy are so important to Catholicism. So I'm wondering how much your church has revealed action beyond that of individual clergy. So full disclosure, I'm a member of the Episcopal Church. I was very happy to hear that the Diocese of Michigan was quite proactive in advocating for women's rights in the early 1970s. And so I just know from my own personal faith experience, the Episcopal Church doesn't exist without really active lay groups. So I'm interested in you commenting perhaps a bit on that, and I think it dovetails with Amy's question. Of course, the important difference between 1970 is now is there's huge decline in church attendance, as you already noted, and synagogue attendance. But yeah, just something more about lay activity and maybe a picture of contrast with that of Catholicism.
Okay, so you touched on like a huge theme of my book. I'm going to try and I'm going to try to organize this in a few ways. And so if I speak sloppily and being recorded, you'll all forgive me, you who are watching this in perpetuity. Okay. Let's start with Catholics and parse out what's going on there. After Vatican II, after Humanae Vitae, there was huge dissension over questions of contraception. But also, if you look at the Clergy Consultation Service's statistics, about 40 to 50% of the women coming to see them were Catholic, right? 40 to 50% of the women coming to see them were Catholic. So it looks like our next speaker is possibly here. Okay, so I'll make it very quick then. I don't know that I can. 40 to 50%, and also Catholic priests and nuns were sort of sub rosa helping the CCS. So what I want to point to is there was dissension within the church. So even as there was a hypermobilization of anti-abortion activism from the top down and through these sort of denominational organizations within the Catholic Church, there was also quiet dissent. I'm just going to leave it at that and show myself off.
Thank you so much, Gil. I'm so thrilled that we have such a wonderful triple header of speakers here to speak to you today, and it's my absolute pleasure to introduce our third and final speaker. Attorney General Dana Nessel is a former criminal prosecutor and civil rights attorney. She was sworn in as Michigan's 54th Attorney General on January 1st, 2019. Since then, she's taken a lead in consumer protection, environmental protection, as well as working to protect elders from abuse. She is, and we'll forgive her for this, a graduate of the University of Michigan and Wayne State University Law School. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. How you doing? Good. Great to be here with you. So my understanding is the topic of discussion here is basically the intersection of Judaism and issues related to abortion and reproductive freedom. So firstly, let me say this. I'll oftentimes people talk about me because I am the first openly gay person to hold statewide elected office in Michigan. And that's true. But I'm also the first person, I'm the first Jewish person to hold this particular office. And other than some Supreme Court justices, I believe, well, I guess you can't exclude Carl Levin, of course, who was a statewide elected, but not too many Jews who have held statewide office in Michigan. I am constantly reminded of the fact that that I'm a minority, and one of the reasons that I wanted to be a lawyer, and one of the reasons that I wanted to be the Attorney General of this state, is because I grew up with such an unyielding belief in what made America great of many things was our principled stand regarding the separation of church and state, because that's the only thing that allows religious minorities in this country to live freely and to have equal treatment under the law and equal rights. And what I have seen over the course of many years, and particularly this has escalated in the last few years, is this just absolute evisceration of the separation of church and state. And we've seen it over and over again. And I would say that this particular United States Supreme Court, seemingly, they've just thrown it completely out the window. And we have, in all candor, I mean, I think we have at least 5, maybe really 6 individuals in the United States Supreme Court that, really believe that their religious beliefs should take the place of our constitutional rights, and that everything they do is sort of filtered through the lens of their religious beliefs. And it has really taken its toll on separation of church and state related issues. But in the last few years, I would say more than anything, what we've really seen is like the interest in sort of I don't want to say imposing Christianity, but a certain type of practice of Christianity on all areas of the law, such that it becomes very, very hard to be a religious minority and feel as though your rights are properly represented. And I think that abortion is one of those places where there's just no way to say that there really is this separation of church and state, because I mean, listen, I'm a Reformed Jew. I grew up going to temple on the high holidays and being bat mitzvahed and, celebrating the way we as Reformed Jews celebrated, which was our interpretation of the Old Testament. Not a word for word type of situation, but I felt really lucky to the extent that, firstly, I grew up with no one telling me that homosexuality was a sin, which was good for somebody like me, that I'd never heard that in temple. And I can't imagine what it would have been like had I heard that from my rabbi, and I never did. But the other thing was that I was not taught specifically that abortion was a sin, and I certainly was taught that in the event where there has to be some sort of a choice between saving the life or the health of the pregnant woman and that of, whether you're talking about a fetus, an embryo, a zygote, a fertilized egg, right? At whatever stage that you save the woman's life. And I don't know the reason for that, except for my speculation is that, well, women's lives were valued to some extent. And then also maybe the thought that they might have other children and you didn't want to leave children to be motherless. I don't know. It was never really fully explained to me. I'll just be honest. We just didn't really talk about it much. It was just sort of that understanding, though, right? And then seeing how, whether you're looking at the loss of rights from the United States Supreme Court under Dobbs, or the imposition of other laws like the 1931 law that is still on the books in Michigan temporarily. It's unenforceable, and more on that in a second. But, there is no caveat, obviously, for incest or for rape or to preserve a woman's health. And then the ambiguity, really, of what it means in our 1931 law, where it says that abortion is permissible to save the life of the woman. Now, that in of itself is problematic, that phrase. And let me tell you why that is. And remembering, of course, this is a 4-year felony. We have very broad aiding and abetting statutes in Michigan. And the way they work essentially is that under our criminal code, we don't have a charge that's called aiding and abetting. We just have the underlying charge. And if you in any way, shape, or form aid or abet or, provide the ability for a criminal offense to occur, you are just as responsible as the principal actor. And so when I say that, what I mean is that it doesn't matter if you are a doctor who terminates a pregnancy, it doesn't matter if you are a nurse or some other sort of medical staff that assists that doctor, it doesn't even matter if you are the receptionist and you take the call and someone says they want to make an appointment to terminate a pregnancy and you schedule it, you are actually just as responsible for that 4-year felony as the physician who actually performs the medical procedure. So what was interesting to me about the phrasing of this is I think for some people that did provide some sort of comfort. Like, okay, this is okay because this correlates religiously, for me, for perhaps other Jews, because you can save that woman's life. Until I will tell you, we had an evidentiary hearing in Oakland County on this. My department representing the governor in her case against the county prosecutors to stop them from enforcing this 1931 law under a number of different Michigan constitutional precepts, equal protection, due process, bodily autonomy. But so we had an evidentiary hearing when we were requesting that there be a preliminary injunction in place so that this law could not be enforced until or unless there was a final disposition of this case, presumably either by the Michigan Supreme Court or, as Judge Jake Cunningham said when he was ordering that the preliminary injunction stay in place until the voters have had their say on Proposal 3, which I'm sure has already been discussed and you all know is the Reproductive Freedom for All ballot proposal. So we had an evidentiary hearing. We had 3 physicians testify, all female as it turned out. One was an OBGYN who also was a professor who taught at the University of Michigan Medical School. One was an emergency room physician, and then the last was our chief medical officer for the state of Michigan. And what they all testified to was essentially this, that no one in the medical community actually understands what it means when you say you can only perform an abortion, you can only terminate a pregnancy to save the woman's life. What does that mean? Like from doctors to obviously they rely on science and they want to be scientifically accurate. And, what exactly, what percentage chance is it that you have to die? Exactly. What if you have preeclampsia? What if you have high blood pressure and the doctor has said it's probably like a 40 to 50% chance that you are going to die either in labor or during the course of your pregnancy? If you're a doctor, right, and if you know that you could very well be charged with this criminal offense, and I mean several things. One, you could be looking at losing your license, which no doctor wants to do. That's the end of their career, right? Secondly, you don't want to lose your malpractice insurance, which can happen. Your malpractice carrier can drop you. And even in terms of going to jail or prison, when you hear what jury's going to convict, right? There's like a 40 or 50% chance that woman was going to die. Are you going to get 12 jurors to convict? Maybe you won't. However, how do you feel about the process of being criminally charged, going in, having to hire an attorney, having a mugshot? First, you got to go to your pre-exam hearing, then you have to go back for several other hearings before you get to your preliminary exam, at which point the prosecutor has to put on evidence to show that it's more likely than not that you committed this offense. And then you get bound over to trial. Then you have several more hearings. You might have some motions, or evidentiary hearings or so forth. Before you finally get to trial, then you have to hire a whole bunch of experts. And those experts have to testify that this procedure was necessary to save the woman's life. And you probably have, competing experts, right? Some will say yes. Some will say, well, maybe, but not really. You could have lived. Others will say, no. And then your fate is in the hands of the jury, and, maybe they will acquit you. Maybe there'll be a hung jury, and you have to go through the whole thing again. Or maybe you'll get convicted, and you will have to risk going to jail or prison for providing a medical procedure that has been legal in the state of Michigan and across the country for nearly 50 years to make sure that that woman didn't die. And think of all the different kinds of complications during the course of a pregnancy that could cause a woman to die. Not necessarily. Maybe it's not a 100% chance. Maybe there's only a 90% chance or an 80% chance. Maybe there's only a 10% chance. And maybe when your doctor says you have this condition and we think there's a 10% chance that you are going to die, there might be some women who say, you know what, I'm good with that. I'm going to take that chance. But then there may be some women who say, I don't want to take that chance. I'm 26 years old. I have my whole life ahead of me. I have another child at home. I don't even want to take a 10% chance that I'm going to die. But she doesn't have that ability to do that under this law, you see. And so what the medical community said, firstly, they're so afraid of not knowing how to quantify this that, honestly, they're just not going to perform the procedure at all because they don't want to risk it, and who would? Then, in addition to that, you had some of these physicians testify that they were conflicted because there are federal laws in place that say that if you can mitigate serious health issues, serious health damage to a patient, you have to. Like, that's your job. When a patient comes into you, you can't say to a person, listen, you have an infection. I could make sure that I stop this in its tracks. I could terminate the pregnancy, which is not going to be a viable pregnancy anyway. Put you on antibiotics. I could perform a D&C or a D&E, and I could have you out of here, and you'd be totally fine. But I can't, because you're not at the point yet where it seems like you're going to die. So if you could just go home and just wait until you get really, really sick. I need your white blood cell count to be so high that you are on literally the brink of death. And at that point, when you come back, maybe if I can still save you, then I will be able to legally do so. So they said that that's a problem for them because they feel like that violates their Hippocratic oath, but also federal law. Also, you have attorneys out there, some who are in this room right now, that might sue your ass if you knew that you could easily save a person's life, easily make sure that they didn't have to have major medical consequences, maybe even lose their uterus or other reproductive organs, and you didn't do it. So you have that complication. The other complication that I thought was pretty interesting that they talked about is they said that the way that doctors learn how to perform abortions and how to terminate a pregnancy is through non-emergency procedures, and that if you aren't able to learn how to do that in a non-emergency setting, you'll never know how to perform one in an emergency set of circumstances. And that, frankly, you just won't have, doctors out there that are willing to train other doctors on this procedure. So there were a lot of complications. But getting back to the Jew part. What I learned, though, is, so to me, I always grew up being like, listen, I consider myself to be pro-choice, and I always have. I think that this is a decision to be made between a woman and her physician, a woman and her family, a woman and her God, and that's not my decision to make for her. But I understand a little bit, right? Like the thought that you are stifling a potential life. Like I don't think people who are pro-life, like I don't think they're crazy. I don't think there's something wrong with them. I disagree with them, and I wish they would make their own decisions for their own bodies the same way that I want to make my decisions for me. But then it kind of went a step further, and Justice Clarence Thomas sort of said the quiet part out loud, and one of the things he's talked about was that also Griswold v. Connecticut, the seminal ruling from 1965 that legalized birth control in all 50 states, should also be overturned. And in fact, the person that I'm running against for Attorney General has said a couple things about this. One, he also agrees that Griswold v. Connecticut should be overturned. Secondly, he thinks that birth control should be, quote, banned at the border like illegal fentanyl shipments, which is a kind of scary thing for a guy who seeks to be the top law enforcement official in the state of Michigan. And so there you had me at, okay, I understand that there are religions that do not believe, that believe birth control is a sin. I understand that. That's not my religion. I was never taught that. If it's a part of Judaism, then I skip that part or something, or my rabbi never talked about it or something. I do know that it's part of Catholicism. I don't know a lot of Catholics that really stick to that part, to be honest with you. I mean, just candidly. But now you have people in these positions of power. It's not just good enough to say, we are going to make sure that there are no abortions, but also we're going to outlaw birth control, even though it's really hard to say, like, who are you hurting in that potential set of circumstances? But then even more so, and I know this from having practiced family law for a long time, I don't know if you know this, but surrogacy is illegal in Michigan, unless it's for free. Free surrogacy is fine. But if you pay the person, then it is illegal, and we're one of only a handful of states where that's the case. And there are a number of other different laws on the books, just seemingly just very, very targeted to a religious audience, but not really what we would call a rational basis under the law. And that's the lowest standard that we have when you're analyzing something, analyzing a law to ferret out its constitutionality. There's strict scrutiny, there's intermediate scrutiny, and then there's rational basis. That's the lowest level there is. And you have to come up with a reason for, if something's going to be constitutional, normally you have to say, well, here's the state interest, the rational reason for this. And I don't know, like birth control, it's just really, I struggle to know what's the rational purpose behind laws that would outlaw birth control even for married couples. Because remember, that's what Griswold v. Connecticut was about. That was a married couple that wanted to use birth control and didn't want to be criminalized, right? Didn't want to be charged and convicted of a crime for that. So I feel like we are really in a territory now where we have individuals that are in incredibly powerful positions. I mean, people in the United States Senate and people on the Supreme Court, United States Supreme Court, and also, frankly, on our Michigan Supreme Court, and legislators, both, obviously federally and in our state legislature, who seemingly, they really just are pushing their religious beliefs on everyone else because there's no way to find a rational basis for it. And I will say, as having been a part of the legal team that tried the same-sex marriage case in Michigan, and that then went on to the United States Supreme Court and got folded into the Obergefell v. Hodges case, which legalized same-sex marriage in all 50 states, I remember being in court. And then, the state, then, ironically, the assistant AGs who all now work for me, making the argument why same-sex marriage had to be illegal. And they had to sort of to be honest with you, they had to make something up, because like you couldn't say that you were hurting someone, right? I mean, who were you hurting? Like two, consenting over the age of 18 adults wanting to marry each other. Like, who is the harmed party here? Who is suffering? Like, we know who's going to suffer if they can't get married, and that's them and their children, because there's this, there's 100 legal rights that attach itself to a marriage contract. But who gets hurt by them marrying? Like, who are the other parties? So they had to, come up with a bunch of different arguments. One of them was that if same-sex marriage was allowed, it would ruin the sanctity of marriage for straight couples, and that straight people just wouldn't want to marry anymore. Your state government made that argument, and paid a lot of money, by the way, to do it. So that was an argument that was rejected. Another was that if same-sex couples were permitted to marry and thus be able to legally adopt children together, the outcomes for those children would be terrible. They'd be addicted to drugs, they'd be promiscuous, and they'd all go to prison. I'm not kidding you. I mean, these are the kind of arguments that were made. Unfortunately for them, there was no actual science behind that. But really, to me, what it was people who, because of their religious beliefs, believed that same-sex marriage should be outlawed, decided to create laws that enveloped those beliefs. But then there was no way to really justify it except for to say it's against my religious belief, because there was no scientific evidence to support these beliefs, and you couldn't turn to something and say, well, here's who's harmed by this. And that's how I look at, for instance, birth control. That's how I look at, again, certainly same-sex marriage. With abortion, like I said, I mean, there are, I think, arguments that are at least a little bit stronger than what we would see on those other issues. But the reason why I think it's really hard to buy into Justice Alito when he's like, this is a potential life. Well, you know what? Who also are not just potential lives, but actual lives. I'm a potential life, and you didn't think I should have the right to marry, and you were fine with that. I mean, so I don't know that I really buy into like that being the real belief. But where we are right now, and I'm sure many of you, I mean, if you're here, you likely know this. Right now, we have a decision by Judge Gleicher in the Court of Claims that is being appealed up through the Court of Appeals on a case where Planned Parenthood sued me, which was weird because they sued me to not enforce a law that I ran on never enforcing. But all right, Planned Parenthood, you win. And so, there's that case. There is, of course, the case that I just talked about against the county prosecutors, only some of which actually said they wanted to enforce the law, but that was enough. So that's being appealed. My prediction is this. My prediction is that the courts of appeal will not do anything to intervene on the injunction between now and Election Day, or when the election is certified, and we'll wait to see if Proposal 3 passes. However, if it doesn't pass, those cases will carry on. If it does pass, those cases will be mooted out, and it will be said, well, there's no reason for these cases anymore, because this is now constitutionally enshrined, the right not just, of course, to abortion, but also birth control, and also the management of miscarriages, and also fertility treatments. So kind of all of that in one. But I will say that's not the end of the story, because what will come next are challenges to this new portion of the Constitution, and whether or not it should actually be permitted to become a provision of the Constitution in Michigan. And I see many challenges coming. I will say the issue as it pertains to my office is that my opponent has been so vehement about his opposition to abortion that he has actually said that he does not even believe there should be an exception to save the life of the woman, which was frankly something I'd never heard someone say out loud before. But I don't have a lot of confidence that he is going to defend the new law. So in the event that there are challenges, it will probably have to be the proponents of the law that actually end up having to defend it in court. There may be, honestly, some standing-related issues related to that, and I say that because of, back to same-sex marriage, the Proposition 8 case, which the only reason why that case, Prop 8, likely did not set the same precedent that our case, so Bergefell v. Hodges, did, is because the state refused to defend Proposition 8. It had to be defended instead by the proponents of the ballot proposal, and the United States Supreme Court threw it out and said, no, it has to be a state actor who actually defends the law. So there's a lot of clustery types of issues that could come up in the event that that occurs. But I will say that more and more, and I will just sort of end with this, you know, it's hard to be in state government. And I mean, I'm not in the legislature, but I know that virtually every day there is a prayer that you know, they open session with, and it's almost exclusively a Christian prayer. And I'm reminded all the time, like I said, that I'm a religious minority. Like constantly in state government, I am reminded of the fact that I am a religious minority. Almost a day doesn't go, you know, doesn't pass without something happening that reminds me that I'm not just the Attorney General of the great state of Michigan, I'm the Jewish Attorney General of the state of Michigan. And I guess I say this as a religious minority. I think our state is worse off for that, and I think our nation is worse off for that. I think we need to have a United States that's inclusive of everybody, irrespective of what your religious beliefs are, or if you have any religious beliefs at all. But I see the constant creep towards trying to legislate and rule from the bench, not really keeping in mind the notion of separation of church and state and equal protection under the law for all, irrespective of what your religious beliefs are, but really the effort to impose, again, not just one religion, but a certain interpretation of that religion upon everyone else. And I don't think that's good for our country, and I think it's making our country a much less free place for us to exist. So those are my thoughts.